At 9:15 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, 600 miles behind his striking force, and waited for news that would validate everything he had warned against for the past decade. 6 months earlier, his aircraft had devastated Pearl Harbor. 6 months of uninterrupted Japanese victories had followed, exactly as he had predicted. Now his massive fleet was converging on Midway Atoll to deliver the knockout blow that would force America to negotiate peace. Yamamoto had 4 heavy aircraft carriers bearing down on the tiny island, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. He had the most experienced naval aviators in the world, pilots who had been training for years and had accumulated combat experience across China and the Pacific. He had every advantage. But Yamamoto also had something none of his fellow admirals possessed. He had lived in America. He had walked its streets, studied in its universities, and played poker with its naval officers. He knew the American character in a way that no other senior Japanese military leader could claim, and that knowledge terrified him. Because Yamamoto understood what his colleagues refused to believe. The Americans were not soft, they were not weak. They were not the decadent materialists that Japanese propaganda portrayed. They were something far more dangerous, an industrial colossus with unlimited resources and a fierce determination that Japan had just provoked with bombs and torpedoes. Within the next 6 hours, everything Yamamoto had feared would come true in the most catastrophic naval defeat in Japanese history. What happened at Midway, and what followed in the 3 years of brutal Pacific warfare that came after, represents one of the greatest failures of strategic perception in military history. Japanese leaders convinced themselves that they understood America. They were catastrophically wrong, and the roots of that failure stretched back decades before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The fundamental problem facing Japan in 1941 was not military, it was perceptual. Japanese military and civilian leaders had constructed an image of America that bore almost no resemblance to reality, and that false image would lead them to make decisions that guaranteed their own destruction. The prevailing view among Japanese leadership was that Americans were spiritually weak. This belief was not simply propaganda for public consumption. Senior generals and admirals genuinely believed it. They believed that a society built on individual rights, democracy, and material comfort could never match the fighting spirit of warriors raised in the Bushido tradition. Japanese officers openly mocked American soldiers as products of a soft culture, young men who had been driven around in automobiles their whole lives and could never endure the hardships of real combat. The Japanese military was convinced of the willingness of its own people to make any sacrifice for the nation, and it was contemptuous of what it saw as the softness of Western democracies, where loyalty and patriotism were tempered by concern for individual rights and personal well-being. In Japanese military thinking, this concern for the individual was a fatal weakness. A soldier who worried about his own survival could never fight with the total commitment that victory required. This contempt ran deep. Japanese military planners assumed that Americans, confronted with a sudden shocking defeat, would lose their will to fight. They believed that a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, people concerned primarily with personal comfort and economic gain, would sue for peace rather than endure a long and bloody war. The phrase heard repeatedly in Tokyo's war councils was that Americans lacked the stomach for a protracted conflict. One good hard blow, they believed, and the Americans would negotiate. Japanese intelligence reports reinforced these assumptions. Officers stationed in Washington and other American cities sent back observations about labor strikes, political divisions, isolationist sentiment, and what they perceived as a general softness in American society. They noted that the United States military was small and poorly equipped compared to the massive armies of Europe and Asia. They calculated that American industrial capacity, while impressive, would take years to convert to war production, years that Japan would use to consolidate an impenetrable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Most Japanese also perceived America to be a violent and immoral country, with gangsters running wild in cities like Chicago and New York. American motion pictures, which played regularly in Japanese theaters, reinforced images of a chaotic and undisciplined society. Japanese intellectuals looked down on American culture as shallow and materialistic, lacking the spiritual depth and historical traditions that characterized Japanese civilization. But there was one Japanese naval officer who knew these assessments were dangerously wrong. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and he had spent 4 years of his life inside the country his colleagues so badly misjudged. Yamamoto was born on April 4, 1884, in the small city of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture. His father was 56 years old at the time of his birth, and following Japanese tradition, the boy was named Isoroku, which literally means 56. He came from a samurai family that had fallen on hard times after the Meiji Restoration, a family that had fought on the losing side during the civil wars that unified Japan. The shame of defeat and loss of status shaped Yamamoto's early years, instilling in him both discipline and a determination to prove his worth through service to the nation. Young Isoroku showed exceptional intelligence and determination despite frequent childhood illnesses. He excelled in mathematics and literature and developed the stubborn willpower that would characterize his entire career. He passed the entrance examinations for the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and graduated in 1904 near the top of his class, just in time for the war with Russia. At the Battle of Tsushima Strait in May of 1905, Ensign Yamamoto served aboard the cruiser Nishin. The battle was a stunning Japanese victory, the first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a European power in a major naval engagement. But for Yamamoto, the battle brought personal suffering. A Russian shell struck the ship and knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, he discovered that he had lost 2 fingers on his left hand and suffered severe wounds to his thigh. The injury would mark him for life, earning him the darkly humorous nickname among geisha who served him of the 80-sen Admiral, a reference to the reduced cost of a manicure for a man with only 8 fingers. But Yamamoto wore his wounds with pride. They represented sacrifice for the emperor and nation, the visible proof that he had paid in blood for his country's glory. After the war, Yamamoto rose steadily through the ranks. His superiors recognized him as exceptionally intelligent, unusually open-minded, and fluent in English. He attended the Naval Staff College where he excelled in strategic thinking. In 1916 he was adopted by the Yamamoto family, a common practice in Japan for preserving distinguished family lines, and took their name. By 1919, Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto had attracted enough attention that the Imperial Japanese Navy selected him for a remarkable assignment. He was sent to the United States to study at Harvard University. Yamamoto arrived in America at the age of 35. He was small even by Japanese standards, standing just 5 feet, 3 inches tall, with broad shoulders and an intense gaze. He enrolled as a special student at Harvard, where he concentrated on studying the American oil industry. This was not an academic curiosity. Oil was the lifeblood of modern naval power. Whoever controlled petroleum supplies controlled the ability to wage war at sea. Yamamoto understood this with perfect clarity, but his real education happened outside the classroom. Japanese officers sent abroad were expected to bring back detailed intelligence about their host countries, and Yamamoto took this responsibility seriously. During his 2 years at Harvard, he traveled extensively across America. He hitchhiked through New England, crossed the Great Plains, visited the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, and explored the industrial centers of the Midwest. He did not simply observe from a distance. He stayed in American homes, ate in American restaurants, and talked with American workers about their lives and beliefs. What Yamamoto saw in America stunned him. He walked through the automobile factories of Detroit and watched American workers assemble cars with a speed and precision that astounded him. The Ford Motor Company's assembly line at Highland Park was producing a new automobile every 93 minutes. The scale of production was beyond anything Yamamoto had ever imagined. He visited steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary where furnaces burned day and night, producing more metal than Japan's entire annual output in a single week. He saw oil refineries in Texas that processed more petroleum in a month than Japan consumed in a year. The numbers were staggering. America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's by every measure. American factories could produce 10 times the automobiles, 20 times the steel, and consumed more oil in a single day than Japan could obtain in months. Yamamoto, trained in strategic thinking, understood immediately what these figures meant for any potential war. The nation that could produce more weapons, more ships, more aircraft, and more supplies would eventually win any extended conflict. Industrial capacity was not just an economic statistic, it was military destiny. Most importantly, Yamamoto studied the American people themselves. He discovered that Americans were not the soft, frivolous people that Japanese propaganda depicted. They were practical, innovative, and possessed a fierce competitive spirit that reminded him of Japan's own samurai traditions. They complained about their government, argued with each other constantly, and seemed obsessed with individual rights. But they also worked incredibly hard, took enormous pride in their accomplishments, and showed remarkable resilience when faced with challenges. Yamamoto also discovered poker. He became obsessed with the game, playing through the night with anyone who would take a seat at the table. His fellow students at Harvard remembered him as a fanatical poker player who won hand after hand through a combination of mathematical calculation, psychological insight, and pure nerve. He used his winnings to fund his travels across America, hitchhiking from state to state during summer breaks. The game taught him to read opponents, to calculate odds, to manage risk, and to understand the American capacity for bluffing, for raising the stakes, and for refusing to fold even when the cards seemed hopeless. Years later, historians would note that Yamamoto's approach to the Pearl Harbor attack reflected his poker education. He was betting everything on a single bold move, trying to knock the best player out of the game good and early, just as he would have done at the card table. When Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1921, he carried knowledge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He understood that America possessed industrial capacity beyond anything Japan could match. He knew that the American character, far from being weak, contained a dangerous combination of pride and determination. And he recognized that any war with the United States would be a gamble that Japan could not afford to lose. In 1926, Yamamoto returned to America as a naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington. For 2 more years, he immersed himself in American society. He attended diplomatic functions, met with American naval officers, and continued his poker education. He described the United States Navy to colleagues as a club for golfers and bridge players, suggesting a certain disdain for the tactical abilities of individual American officers. But this contempt was limited to the poker table and the wardroom. In broader strategic matters, Yamamoto never underestimated what America could do when fully mobilized. During this second posting, Yamamoto developed what he called a healthy respect for American industrial capacity. He had seen how American factories converted production during the Great War, switching from consumer goods to weapons with remarkable speed. He had studied how American shipyards could build vessels faster than any navy in the world. He understood that the same assembly line techniques that produced millions of automobiles could produce thousands of aircraft, tanks, and ships if America ever decided to turn its industrial might toward war. He also understood something about American psychology that his colleagues missed entirely. Americans did not like to start fights. They were content to pursue commerce and entertainment. But once attacked, once their pride was wounded, they would fight with a fury that few nations could match. The American Civil War had demonstrated this willingness to suffer tremendous casualties for principle. Yamamoto had studied that war and understood its lessons. Throughout the 1930s, as Japan moved toward increasingly aggressive policies in Asia, Yamamoto became one of the few senior officers willing to speak openly about the dangers of war with America. He opposed the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. He opposed the full-scale war with China that began in 1937. And he fiercely opposed the tripartite pact that allied Japan with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in 1940. His opposition made him dangerous enemies. Japanese ultranationalists saw Yamamoto as a traitor who had been corrupted by his time in America. He received death threats almost daily. Junior officers at the Navy Ministry asked him to join an attempted coup in February of 1936. He ordered them back to their desks without a murmur. By 1938, The situation had become so dangerous that the Navy Minister, Mitsumasa Yonai, sent Yamamoto back to sea, assigning him as commander of the combined fleet, partly to protect him from assassination. It was, in a sense, a promotion into exile. But Yamamoto's warnings only intensified. When Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono asked him directly about Japan's chances in a war with the United States, Yamamoto gave an answer that would prove prophetic. "If we are ordered to do it," he said, "then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months. But I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. I hope you will make every effort to avoid war with America." 6 months. Yamamoto calculated that Japan had exactly 6 months to win the war or face inevitable defeat. After that, American industrial production would overwhelm everything Japan could put into the field. Factories that currently made refrigerators and washing machines would produce bombs and bullets. Shipyards that built merchant vessels would launch aircraft carriers. Young men from farms and cities across a continent would become soldiers and sailors. American might would be fully mobilized. Yamamoto made similar predictions to other officials. In September of 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, he told one group that for a while we will have everything our own way, stretching out in every direction like an octopus spreading its tentacles. But it will last for a year and a half at the most. He compared Japan's military situation to that of a man who has stolen a tiger by the tail, unable to let go but facing destruction if he holds on. But Yamamoto's warnings fell on deaf ears. The army generals and most of his fellow admirals dismissed his concerns. They believed in the superiority of Japanese spirit over American materialism. They had convinced themselves that one decisive battle would break American will, just as the Battle of Tsushima had broken Russian will in 1905. They could not imagine that a nation they considered soft and divided would fight a long, brutal war across thousands of miles of ocean. Their overconfidence in their own abilities and underestimation of the will of other nations were rooted in their own misleading ethnic and racial stereotypes. The decision for war was made by others. In October of 1941, General Hideki Tojo became Prime Minister. Tojo was Yamamoto's old enemy, a hardliner who had long advocated for expansion and who had been instrumental in Japan's takeover of Manchuria. Under his leadership, Japan committed to war with America and Britain. Yamamoto was ordered to devise a plan to neutralize American naval power in the Pacific. Despite his objections to the war itself, Yamamoto was a naval officer bound by duty. If Japan was going to fight America, he would give his country the best possible chance of success. That meant striking first, striking hard, and hoping that a stunning opening blow would accomplish what he knew conventional warfare could not. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves that devastated the American Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 2,400 Americans died. It was one of the most successful surprise attacks in military history. But Yamamoto felt no joy. While his staff officers celebrated, he spent the day after Pearl Harbor sunk in apparent depression. He later wrote that a military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame simply for the one smitten. The American aircraft carriers had been at sea during the attack and escaped destruction. The oil storage facilities and repair yards remained intact. Most critically, Yamamoto understood something his jubilant subordinates did not. The attack had unified America in a way that nothing else could have. The nation he had studied and understood was now fully mobilized for war. In the following weeks, Yamamoto received intelligence reports about American reactions to Pearl Harbor. Congress had declared war with only one dissenting vote. Young men were flooding recruiting stations across the country. Factories were converting to war production faster than Japanese planners had thought possible. The very characteristics that Japanese leaders had dismissed, American industrial capacity, democratic unity in crisis, and stubborn determination, were now mobilizing against the empire. Yamamoto later confided that a lot of people are feeling relieved or saying they are grateful to Admiral Yamamoto because there have not been any air raids. They are very wrong. The fact that the enemy has not come is no thanks to Admiral Yamamoto, but to the enemy himself. So if they want to express gratitude to somebody, I wish they would express it to America. If the latter really made up its mind to wade in on us, there would be no way of defending a city like Tokyo. Even in apparent victory, Yamamoto understood how vulnerable Japan truly was. For exactly 6 months, Yamamoto ran wild across the Pacific, just as he had predicted. Japanese forces captured Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. The empire's defensive perimeter expanded to encompass millions of square miles of ocean and land. Japanese soldiers and sailors believed they were invincible. British, Dutch, and American forces crumbled before them. It seemed that nothing could stop the advance. But Yamamoto knew the clock was ticking. He needed to destroy the American aircraft carriers before American industrial production tipped the balance. He devised a plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll, a tiny outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The plan was complex, perhaps too complex, dividing Japanese forces into multiple groups spread across vast distances. But Yamamoto believed he had no choice. He had to knock out America's carrier capability, while Japan still held the advantage. What Yamamoto did not know was that American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications. A team at Station Haipo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to determine that a major attack was being planned against a location designated as AF. When American intelligence sent a fake message from Midway reporting a shortage of fresh water, the Japanese helpfully confirmed that AF was short of fresh water. The Americans now knew exactly where and when Yamamoto planned to strike. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Midway Island. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the 4 Japanese carriers from his flagship Akagi, believed he had achieved tactical surprise. His planes pounded the American base, while his pilots prepared for a second strike. But 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were waiting just over the horizon. Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned them based on the intelligence breakthrough, turning Japanese tactical surprise into an American strategic trap. The battle began badly for the Americans. Torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers attacked the Japanese fleet and were slaughtered. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 of its aircraft. Only 1 pilot survived. Of the 41 torpedo planes launched from the carriers, only 6 returned, and not a single torpedo scored a hit. But their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters down to low altitude and disrupted Japanese carrier operations at a critical moment. When American dive bombers arrived minutes later, they found the Japanese carriers exposed and vulnerable, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. At 10:22 in the morning, dive bombers from Enterprise screamed down out of the sun. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were blazing infernos. Bombs had penetrated to their hangar decks, where aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition exploded in chain reactions that turned the ships into floating crematoriums. Later that afternoon, aircraft from the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu managed to cripple Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes, but American planes found Hiryu before sunset and turned it into a burning wreck like her sisters. In a single day, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and most of their experienced aviators. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the core of Japanese naval striking power. The pilots who went down with them, men who had trained for years and accumulated thousands of hours of flight experience, could never be replaced. Japan's aircraft training programs simply could not produce pilots of equivalent skill quickly enough to matter. It took years to create a naval aviator capable of the precision attacks that characterized Japanese operations. It took minutes to kill one. Yamamoto received the news aboard Yamato with what witnesses described as stoic calm. His chief of staff later wrote that he felt bitter, that he felt like swearing. Inside, Yamamoto must have felt something closer to anguish. Everything he had predicted was coming true. The 6 months were over. From this point forward, American industrial capacity would grind Japan down in a war of attrition that the empire could not win. In Tokyo and across Japan, the Midway disaster was kept secret from the public. Wounded survivors were isolated in hospitals where they could not speak to anyone. The government announced a great victory. But within the military, those who understood the truth began to realize that Yamamoto had been right all along. The war they had started so confidently was now a war they could not win. The 18 months following Midway transformed the Pacific War into exactly the grinding attritional struggle Yamamoto had warned against. American forces launched their first major offensive in August of 1942, landing Marines on a jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain called Guadalcanal. The Japanese had been building an airfield there. The Americans intended to take it. On Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers who had been told that Americans were weak discovered the truth in brutal close-quarters combat. Marines and Army soldiers fought with a ferocity that shocked Japanese veterans. The Americans did not break. They did not sue for peace. They kept coming. Night after night, Japanese troops launched banzai charges against American positions, and night after night they were cut down by machine gun fire and artillery. The Americans showed no signs of the spiritual weakness that Japanese propaganda had promised. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal faced another enemy that revealed the true nature of American power. They faced logistics. While Japanese soldiers starved, subsisting on roots and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle, American forces received steady supplies of food, ammunition, medical equipment, and reinforcements. The contrast was devastating. Japan's industrial capacity was roughly 10% of America's, and that disparity showed in every aspect of the campaign. The Japanese could not use slow transport ships to supply their troops because American aircraft from Henderson Field, the captured airfield, would sink them in daylight. Instead, they relied on fast destroyer runs that sailors called rat transportation, which could only carry limited supplies. The result was systematic starvation. By December of 1942, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were losing 50 men per day to malnutrition, disease, and American attacks. The idea that had prevailed in Tokyo, that one overwhelming offensive would capture the airfield, proved impossible to implement when troops were too weak from hunger to carry their weapons. Vice Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who commanded the destroyer runs, later wrote that there was no question that Japan's doom was sealed with the closing of the struggle for Guadalcanal. The island that Japanese planners had dismissed as an insignificant outpost became the graveyard of Japanese imperial ambitions. Japan eventually evacuated its surviving troops in February of 1943, conceding the island after 6 months of fighting. It was the first time in the Pacific War that Japanese forces had retreated. Throughout 1942 and 43, the reality that Yamamoto had tried to warn his colleagues about became impossible to ignore. American shipyards launched new carriers faster than Japan could sink them. In 1943 alone, America commissioned 50 new aircraft carriers of various sizes. Japan could not match that output even if its shipyards worked around the clock. American factories produced aircraft by the tens of thousands. American training programs churned out pilots who, while less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, were increasingly numerous and increasingly skilled. The assembly lines that Yamamoto had watched in Detroit were now producing the instruments of Japan's destruction. The contrast in pilot training was particularly stark. Japan started the war with perhaps the best-trained naval aviators in the world. But as those pilots were killed in combat, Japan could not replace them. Training programs were shortened, fuel for practice flights became scarce, and new pilots went into combat with hundreds fewer flight hours than their predecessors. Meanwhile, American training programs expanded massively, turning out pilots who had more flight time than many Japanese veterans. By 1944, the average American naval aviator was better trained than the average Japanese naval aviator, a complete reversal from the war's beginning. By April of 1943, Yamamoto was headquartered at Rabaul in the South Pacific, overseeing desperate defensive operations against the advancing Americans. He had aged visibly since Pearl Harbor. The constant strain of knowing that his predictions were coming true, that his country was fighting a war it could not win, weighed heavily on him. In a letter written around this time, he confided to a friend that he sensed his life must be completed in the next 100 days. On April 13,